So when we finished off last session, we were talking about the baby boom, and what you had happen is, you have these individuals that, some of the things that are going to happen is that number one, a lot of these kids that are born in 1946, 1947, 1948, 6 years later, guess what? They're starting school, and you have this large influx of kids that are coming into school. And the thing is, this isn't just going to be a 2, 3, 4 year event. The baby boom, depending on what source you look at or you reference, goes anywhere from most will say 1946 to 1964. So you're looking at 18 years. So for 18 consecutive years, you're going to see, starting in 1952. From 1952 to 1968, you are going to see a large number of kids entering school each year, which means then that group are going to go from elementary school together into junior high, into high school. And remember, Eisenhower cut spending to schools. So what's going to happen is that all of a sudden schools are going to become overcrowded very quick. There aren't going to be enough supplies. There's going to be shortages of what it is that kids need to properly learn. And this is something that's going to plague the United States until we get to LBJ, and then LBJ finally starts to put more money back into schools. Not only that, if you follow baby boomers all the way through, not only are they going to be going through, they're going to start school together, they're going to graduate school together, they're going to go on to college, they're going to graduate college, they're going to start their families. That's why we have this second smaller baby boom that happens here in the late 70s, early 80s. But now we get to the present, and what you're seeing is you have more and more people that are getting to retirement age at the same time. If you look at the average age of the United States, starting back in 2011 and now continuing on until we get to almost 2030, you're going to see the average age of people in the United States getting older. The reason being is because these baby boomers, and people are living longer now than they were before. And so those two factors combined is why the average age of the U.S. is getting older. Next, then, technological advances. Right now, we're going through the coronavirus. When they finally come up with a vaccine for this, it's going to be huge. But Jonas Salk in the 1950s comes up with a vaccine for polio. Polio was a crippling disease. I realized, cancer is a horrendous disease. The coronavirus is a horrendous disease. Polio was all of that and then some. It terrorized this entire country. It did not discriminate. It would affect everyone. It didn't matter, old, young, black, white, rich, poor. Everyone was susceptible to contracting it. And it actually was harder on someone the younger you were, which made it even worse. Jonas Salk comes up with a vaccine. And the thing about this is Salk actually creates it. Isn't sure, though, as to how well it's going to work. He's pretty sure he's got it nailed down. But to test it, he actually injects his family with the polio vaccine and then injects them with a vaccine that he made. And fortunately for all involved, it worked. Salk lived in the Pittsburgh area. So students in Pittsburgh were some of the first school-age students to get vaccinated. Until we come up with a cure for cancer, and now until we come up with a cure for, not a cure, but a vaccine for COVID-19, Jonas Salk's vaccine for polio, biggest medical breakthrough in the history of the United States, until hopefully those other two happen. I'm guessing the coronavirus one's going to happen first. Hopefully at some point, doctors will be able to get a better grasp on what's going on with cancer. I know they are working diligently on this, but Jonas Salk, American doctor, American hero in my eyes. Now we're going to get to the last section. This is section 4 of chapter 22. The new pop culture. 80% of TVs have homes. People are staying home and watching TV. The makers of TV programs know this, so they're coming up with more and more TV programs. You have all kinds of TV shows. You have the Lone Ranger. You have the Mickey Mouse Club. You have the Howdy Doody Show. You have, now I can't, is kind of the predecessor to like the David Letterman Show. But with more and more people staying at home, fewer people are going to the movies. So what happens is those in the movies say, you know what, we need to do something to increase those going to the movies. So they create what's called the CinemaScope. What this does is it makes the movie-going experience that much better. The CinemaScope to the 1950s is kind of what the IMAX theater is for people today. And so now people have a wider variety. You know, do they want to stay at home? Do they want to watch a variety of TV shows? The TV show I was thinking of that I couldn't think of the name of was the Ed Sullivan Show. It was a variety show. Ed Sullivan would get guests in there, performers, comedians, up-and-coming actors, whatnot, to come perform on his TV show. Then you have the rock and roll movement that starts. Rock and roll really has its roots in Cleveland, Ohio. Alan Freed was a disc jockey at a radio station. That was a guy back then that would play the records. And oftentimes what would happen is for these radio stations, where the disc jockey would sit was like right in front of the building. So there'd be like this huge picture glass window. And that's where he would sit, and people could drive, or I should say not he, but she, and people would drive by and they could see the disc jockey playing the records. And maybe if you happen to drive by in between songs and you wave, they might say something. And if you have your radio going, you know, you might hear, they're not going to know your name, but you're going to hear it. Of course, kids are going to scream and freak out and everything. Well, Alan Freed notices that down the street there's a record store, and there's kids gathering around the record store. Oftentimes what record store owners would do is they would hang a speaker from the overhang that was out in front of the store, so that you would walk through downtown areas and all the stores would have overhangs on them. That way, as you walk downtown, if it was raining, you could stay dry. And so what the record store owners would do is they would mount speakers in the corners, and then they would pipe music out there. And so that way someone's walking by and they hear a song and they're like, wow, I really like that song. I like the beat. I like the tempo. I like the rhythm with it. And then they could go inside and say, hey, what's that song you're playing? And next thing you know, they're selling records. I mean, great PR move. And so Alan Freed goes down to this record store and he asks the owner, what's this music that you're playing that the kids are listening to? And Alan Freed says, well, it's kind of a mixture. It's kind of rock, it's kind of jazz, it's rhythm and blues. It's just kind of a mixture of everything. Alan Freed goes back to his radio station, and he tells the guy in charge, tells the station manager, hey, I really think we need to be playing this music. There's a whole segment of the population out there that isn't listening to the radio, and we start playing this music, we're going to get them. And and then people that have businesses that these kids frequent, they're going to want to advertise on our radio station. The station manager's like, well, I don't know. I said, I tell you what, I'll give you this time slot. And it was more of an evening time slot, and we'll play that music then. And they start playing the music, and lo and behold, the radio station's numbers start going through the roof in terms of the number of people that are listening to the radio station, and it's younger kids, and it's all because of this music. And when Alan Freed is asked, well, what kind of music is this? Alan Freed actually coins the term rock and roll. So, where is the Rock and Roll Music Hall of Fame today? Cleveland, Ohio. Why Cleveland, Ohio? Because Alan Freed, who was a disc jockey at a Cleveland radio station, coined the phrase rock and roll. And again, if we were in class, we'd look at the top 50 songs of the 1950s. And obviously Elvis is going to be the king of rock and roll, not just for all time, but through the 1950s. But one of the things that happens is that the lyrics, the suggestive lyrics in the music really created a gap between kids and their parents. You have to remember, during the 1930s, it was the Great Depression. There wasn't a lot of music. And if there was music, it wasn't about how great things were. And then the 1940s, most of that was encompassed by World War II. So now we get to the 1950s, and with the exception of the Korean War, which was really done by 1953, the rest of the 50s is free from any controversy, turmoil, anything like that. Kids can focus on being kids, and music is one of the things that they're drawn to, and the parents can't stand the music, and so you have this generation gap that is created. Not only that, because of the money situation, most kids have their own cars. They have their cars. They're listening to music. They're going to dances. The dances that they had back then were oftentimes called sock hops. The reason why they were called a sock hop is that the places where they would have these dances is where square dancing would take place. Now, I'm not a connoisseur of square dancing, but what little bit I do know is that the shoes that are worn have very, very smooth soles to them. And they would throw very fine sand out on the floor. And so then when the dancers would do their do-si-dos and their twirls and whatever else they do during a square dance, it just made it that much easier. So when the kids would go to these dances, the boys oftentimes wore what were called penny loafers, and the soles very, very smooth. Well, you wear those out on that floor with that sand out there, and it was like walking on ice. And so kids would oftentimes just take their shoes off and they would dance in their socks, and so that's why they were called sock hops. The last thing, we talked about the 1950s and how the prosperity of it from an economic perspective. Not everybody saw the prosperity. You still had about 30 million people in the United States that were living below the poverty line. And the poverty line is a number that the federal government creates, and it just says if your household is bringing in less than this dollar amount, you are said to be living in poverty. Now, that number is going to vary depending on the number of people in the household. The more people that live in the household, the more money that a family has to be making in order to be considered living below the poverty line. Again, because of time constraints, I really can't get into how they derive that. But just know that the people that were most susceptible in the 1950s to living in poverty, and for the most part, this hasn't changed a great deal from the 1950s all the way to the 2000 teens, but single moms, the elderly, minority immigrants, especially Hispanics, inner city residents, people that lived in Appalachia, this is the Appalachian Mountains, and Native Americans. This is still fairly true today. I wish we had a little bit more time to, go a little in depth about the inner city residents, because when people moved to suburbia, they left the inner cities. And when the people went, the businesses went. And that's why inner cities became really run down in the 1950s, which is why when JFK and LBJ become presidents, that's one of their main focuses. So this